Hi, this is MaryJo Webster again. This is part 2 of my videos on how to file a good public records request. In this one, we're going to talk about actually writing that request, whether that's going to be a letter, an email, or filled out in a data portal. You want to make sure the wording is on target. The main thing is you want a very specific listing of what you want, including the universe and anything regarding time and scope. If there's a specific report you're asking for, hopefully you have the name of that report, the title, any language that the agency uses in reference to that materials. Maybe you're casting kind of a wide net, like I want all memos, reports, internal correspondence, and any other documents pertaining to XYZ. There's this kind of art to writing this section. You want it to be broad, but you also don't want it to be too broad. You could end up with too many things that go beyond the scope of what you're asking for. But if you make it too narrow, you could also miss something. So this is where if you can get that agency to talk to you ahead of time, this will be a lot easier to write. If you can't get them to talk to you, as I suggested in the previous video, then you just have to do your best here. I suggest having somebody else read this and tell you what they think that means, how you've worded it. Somebody who has no idea kind of what you're asking for, maybe is not involved in your day-to-day work. If you're expecting something like a spreadsheet, don't ask for a list of things or a report. Trust me, you'll probably get a PDF and it will not be a spreadsheet. One of the things to include in your request is you can either ask to inspect the data, which in Minnesota will be free, meaning you'd have to go to the agency and they would provide access to that for you. If it's paper, they'll put it in front of you on a desk. They might allow you to go on a computer terminal and look at the digital version of whatever it is you've asked for. If you want copies, tell them what format you hope to have. So for example, if you're pretty sure something exists as a PDF, ask for it directly as a PDF. Don't make assumptions. Ask that you get it in the original format that it was stored in. And of course, if you're asking for data in a spreadsheet, make sure you do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If you're not going to inspect the data, if it's the copy thing, how are they going to get it to you? Are they going to attach it to an email? Are they going to put it on a thumb drive and you pick it up? Will they post it on an FTP server or a Dropbox account and you download it? Is there some other way to get it there? And if you're not sure, if you don't have a preference on something, you could put in a sentence that basically says, when the data is ready, please contact me by email or phone to discuss how to transfer it to me. There's a few boilerplate things that you really got to have. So one is, if any or all of this request will be denied or redacted, please notify me in advance in writing, including the specific state statute or there might be some federal rules that categorize this information as not public. Those federal things might be FERPA if you're dealing with a school, might be HIPAA if you're dealing with something health related. But in Minnesota, this is required that they have to give you the specific state statute that allows them to withhold anything, even if it's just redacting or leaving out a simple piece of information. And you should get this from them to make sure they are upholding the law. Another boilerplate thing, if there will be any cost, please provide a written estimate in advance of filling my request. You do not want to be surprised by a $500 bill. And I've seen this happen before. So ask them to tell you ahead of time what they think it would cost. In Minnesota, the cost thing, it's a situation where an agency may charge you. They're not required to. And so sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's kind of all over the road. And some of it depends on how complicated your request would be. If you're a journalist, you can request a fee waiver saying you're working on behalf of the public. Of course, you want to ask nicely for a fee waiver. I do recommend trying to give them some sort of a deadline. In Minnesota, there's no time limit on when they have to respond. It's listed as a reasonable amount of time, which has been vaguely defined, but it really depends on how complicated your request is. So if you think they should be able to do it in a week or 2 weeks or 2 days, maybe put that down. You could ask them to get in touch with you and let you know what they think it might be, like how long it might take. I've found recently that a lot of agencies seem to want a deadline. I don't know if that goes into their work process and they kind of decide which ones to prioritize. But I find ones without a deadline sometimes get lost and then they forget about it until I call and pester them about it. And then suddenly, oh, here's your data. Of course, provide your contact information and ask them to contact you with any questions. In Minnesota, we're not required to tell them who we are under the law. However, I think you will get a much better response from them if you do be transparent and upfront with them about who you are. And of course, you want some way for them to contact you, although there's ways to get around that too. So put your contact information in there. If you're asking for bulk data, so those things that are coming out of a database system that you might get in a spreadsheet or some other data structure format, some wording you want to put in there would be something like, please provide the data in a machine-readable format, such as comma-separated values text file. I've also taken recently to telling them what software I'm planning to work with the data in, because we ran into a situation where we asked for a comma-separated values text file, knowing that the data would be quite large, and the agency assumed we would be working with it in Excel. And so they told us that, oh, this was going to take them so long to fill this request because they had to slice the data up into separate files so that with 60,000 rows each. And we were really puzzled by that and we're like, why? And they said, well, that's the only thing that will fit in Excel. You're going to have to break it up in order to work with it in Excel. And we kind of laughed for a minute. We're like, we're going to be working with it in MySQL data server. And then they were like, oh, okay, we'll get you one file. And here you go. So sometimes if I know it's a big data set and I don't want them to make assumptions, I'll say I'm going to work with it in MySQL. Or if I'm asking for GIS mapping files, I tell them that I'm using it in ArcGIS or QGIS or whatever it is I'm using, so they know that I'm no dummy. I have the skills to work with this big file. You also want to make sure you ask for documentation about the data. So with these big data files, you want, please provide any data documentation such as a record layout, data dictionary, codebook, or any other documents that are necessary for me to understand the data. And one last thing, some big data sets at government agencies might be stored as a relational data set where there's multiple tables and there's information in each table and you have to join them together to get it all to go together nicely. If you think that's the case, you want to let them know that you are okay with getting the data that way. I've had agencies charge me a lot of money because they took time to join it all together and give me one flat CSV file, assuming that I would not be able to join it myself. And so I ended up paying them to do work that I could have done myself. So let's go through a few examples. In Minnesota, you should always start with, this is a request under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. In another state, whatever your state statute is or what your public records law is called, that would be the first sentence on every one. More boilerplate there, right? And here's an example of law enforcement data. They're required to make request for service data public immediately following an incident. And in the law, they actually call it request for service. So I've put that in here and I put it in quotes to make it very clear. And I've given them the universe at this particular address on this particular day. Notice I say any and all incidents. Perhaps I know that there's only one incident at that location, but to be safe, maybe just put any and all, just in case. And then also I've put, please include all public fields of information, including but not limited to the following. And that's a kind of a boilerplate phrase I use a lot. And then notice I've put some items into bullets. I've discovered that if I write a request that is asking for multiple things, in this case, multiple pieces of information, but maybe I have a request where I want this document and that report and this other memo and this other thing, and I know that they're all separate things, instead of listing them separated by commas in a paragraph, I put it into a bullet to give the agency kind of a checklist to make sure they don't forget something. This is a lot easier for them to see all the things I want rather than a list with commas. So put that there. And then, of course, below that, you'd put all that boilerplate language that I just went through a little bit about the how you're going to get it to me and the cost and if you're going to redact anything and your contact information and all that. As I said in the first video, these requests are a lot more complicated when you start asking for structured data. Here's an example where I know they're stored in separate data files. And so I've told them that right up front. So I'm saying I'm requesting data on childcare license holders, inspections of their facilities, and details on violations as a result of those inspections. In hindsight, maybe I should have put those 3 things as bullets to make it really super clear. But then I say, I understand that this information is stored in separate data files. Please provide me the data in the same fashion, including any unique identifiers that will be needed to join the tables together. That, of course, makes me look smart, and I know what is needed to work with this data, and that's going to help get this through the pipeline faster. And then here's where I start to go in the universe. Please include all individuals, organizations who held a valid license at any point between January 1, 2005 and December 31st, 2017. Notice that I didn't say between 2005 and 2017. That is vague. What do I mean by 2005? And the term like since, I see a lot of requests where it says something like, give me everything since 2005. Well, do you mean January 1, 2006? Or do you mean January 1, 2005? Like, what do you mean by that? Sometimes I put that end date on there, like here, December 31st. Sometimes I'll say to present day to try to get as current as possible. It depends on the situation. And then again, please include all public fields of information. You'll see that there's other paragraphs here for each one for the universes of each of the different kinds of data. So here I've got for the inspection data, all inspections of these childcare providers between January 1, 2000 and present. And then same thing with the violations. Probably should have added the please include all public fields of information into each of those sentences as well. Just make it super, super clear. Here's one more example. Let's say I want to get payroll data from the Minneapolis School District. That universe, who am I getting payroll data for? Well, keep in mind that people work at a place, they might get one paycheck, or maybe they got a paycheck, January 5th, and then they retired and they were gone. Or they came and worked one time and then they were like, oh, I'm done, I'm out of this job. Or there's, people who worked all year, or some variation in between. So to make sure you get everybody, you say, employees who were paid in one or more pay periods during calendar year 2017. Keep in mind some agencies work on fiscal years and you might need to work on a fiscal year if that's how they operate. Again, that's something to think about when you're talking to them. Hopefully, those conversations you'd have with an agency would help illuminate how they keep their information and who's in there. And this request actually came from a meeting with, I think I actually met with the St. Paul School District to talk about payroll data. And we had a meeting with them and they explained to us what they kept and how they kept it and what was all tracked and how some pieces of information were stored in one data set and some in another. And that helped me understand how this all works. So in this case, the pay data is in one place, like all those little pieces of information you see on your pay stub. And then they have a separate data set where they keep human resources information. That's where you get the job titles and your FTE hours, their current employment status, and other things that might be more consistent across all the pay periods, but it's just knowing that it's stored separately, it's a good idea to ask for them separately, but make sure you ask for that employee ID number that you can use then to join between the two tables. So a few miscellaneous things. Again, the paper trail, make sure you have written correspondence for everything. If the agency calls you in response to your request, ask them to send a follow-up email detailing what they told you in an email, for example. And make sure you have notes and you know where all these things are, just in case you have to fight for access. How often should you pester them when they haven't responded? As I said earlier, Minnesota doesn't have a deadline that they have to meet. So I usually start by sending occasional emails asking for an update, especially if it's been 1 week, 2 weeks. If I know it's a really big request, I give them a little more time. But at some point, I start pestering them every week if they're really getting beyond where I thought they should have gotten it to me. And then, of course, get on the phone and call them if they aren't responding to your emails. And that might help. I have had a few instances where this follow-up, the response from them has been, oh, yeah, your request, I'll get it to you this afternoon. And it was really obvious that they just forgot. So don't assume they're just busy working on it. Check in with them very nicely when you think it's appropriate. And then the last thing, get the data, tell them thank you. Even if your deadline, if you're a journalist, for example, your deadline is passed and you're not going to use the data for a story anymore. Even if you're a public citizen and you're like, oh gosh, that took so long and now I don't need it anymore, or it's just too late, don't let them think that it doesn't matter anymore. We don't want to have situations where they do all that work and for nothing, and then you walk away from it. So if you requested paper or you requested a chance to inspect, go to the place, go get it, go do the inspection, whatever it needs to be, even if you don't need it anymore. Thank you for watching.